In the dying light of April 1945, as the thunder of artillery rolled across the ruined towns of Bavaria, an American convoy crept through the shattered streets of a village called Garmisch. Smoke hung over the rooftops, and the air smelled of damp earth and cordite. German families emerged from cellars, clutching children whose faces were streaked with ash and tears. Among the tanks and jeeps, men in olive uniforms dismounted, not with weapons raised, but with bandages, morphine kits, and stretchers. The war had not yet ended, but here, amid the rubble, something unexpected was beginning. A medic named Corporal James Harlan stepped into a wrecked house, where a woman knelt beside her son. The boy's leg was torn by shrapnel from a shell fired hours earlier. The mother looked up in terror, expecting cruelty or arrest. Harlan crouched silently, his helmet still streaked with mud from the Rhine crossing. He reached for his field kit. The mother whispered, "Bit. Ist nur ein kind." The American nodded once and tore his sleeve to make a bandage. Outside, the rumble of guns faded into distant thunder as the boy whimpered and the medic worked with steady hands. For months, Allied troops had been conditioned to see Germany as the enemy. The propaganda posters showed uniformed Nazis, grinning monsters in helmets, marching through Europe. But when the soldiers of the 45th Infantry Division entered the countryside, they found not an army, but a nation of civilians starving and broken. Roads were filled with refugees dragging carts, pushing bicycles, and carrying infants wrapped in blankets torn from curtains. They looked like ghosts, one GI muttered as his jeep rolled past. Only the children still had eyes that moved. In nearby barns, the U.S. Army set up makeshift aid stations. German civilians, hesitant and trembling, brought their wounded. There were girls with burned hands, boys coughing from gas fumes, and old men shivering with fever. The medics treated them alongside wounded American soldiers, ignoring the disbelief in every German stare. Some mothers cried openly when they realized their children were being saved by the same uniforms they had been taught to fear. A private scribbled in his notebook, wondering if kindness was also a weapon. Rumors spread fast through the nearby valleys that the Americans were feeding German children chocolate and canned peaches, that their doctors stitched wounds without asking allegiance. The Wehrmacht had told them that surrender meant torture, that Americans would shoot prisoners or let them starve. Yet the first thing many saw of the conquerors was stretchers, not rifles. They came with white crosses on their arms, one villager said later, and with them came hope. In every town captured, the same transformation occurred. A company would arrive, weapons at the ready, eyes wary. But once the firing stopped, they found hospitals in ruin, children infected from untreated wounds, and mothers pleading silently in doorways. The medics, trained for combat casualty evacuation, began improvising civilian triage. In one schoolhouse converted into an aid post, American nurses boiled water over camp stoves and cleaned wounds with iodine, while local girls translated. The war's final weeks had turned soldiers into doctors and conquerors into caretakers. It was not out of softness. Most were hardened men, veterans of Anzio, of the Hurtgen Forest, and of the drive through France. They had seen comrades burned in tanks and buried in frozen mud. Yet standing over a child crying from infection, their anger collapsed. The front lines had shifted from trenches to humanity itself. "If you can stop bleeding," Sergeant Owens said as he lifted a boy with a broken arm, "then maybe the war stops too." His words were never recorded officially, but others remembered them in the ruins of Nuremberg. The 3rd Army Medical Corps opened a civilian treatment ward inside a bombed-out theater. The stage lights hung twisted from the ceiling, but stretchers lined the floor. Each day, German mothers carried their children through shattered archways. They waited silently as American hands stitched, bandaged, and disinfected. Sometimes the medics played harmonica to calm the children. The sound drifted through the wreckage like something from another world, a world without uniforms or flags. Not every soldier agreed. Some men muttered that mercy for the enemy dishonored the dead. Others couldn't bear to look at German civilians at all. "My brother's buried in Bastogne," one GI said through clenched teeth. "And now I'm fixing their kids?" But duty persisted. Orders from the higher command were clear: maintain discipline, uphold humanity, and prevent vengeance. General Eisenhower had warned that the eyes of history were watching. The Americans were to show what victory meant. Not annihilation, but civilization. In small villages like Dachau and Regensburg, field kitchens were set up for refugees. Lines of civilians stretched down the roads, clutching empty tins. Soldiers handed out powdered milk and bread. The same hands that had fired rifles at the Siegfried Line now opened cans and poured water for thirsty children. They were skeletons, recalled one captain. But when they smiled, it was like seeing something reborn. The children began following the convoys, running behind jeeps, shouting chocolate. Chocolate. Soldiers laughed and tossed candy bars from their rations. For a brief moment, the front line melted away into laughter echoing between ruins. Yet beneath the compassion, there was also silence, an unspoken understanding of guilt. The soldiers had walked through concentration camps only days before. They had seen piles of bodies, smelled ashes, and witnessed what had been done in the name of the Reich. Now, when they saw children with the same pale hair and frightened eyes, they hesitated. Could innocence survive in a land that had built such horror? One lieutenant wrote in his diary that saving those children felt like giving humanity a second chance. The German parents watched, speechless, as their supposed enemies tended to their wounded. For years, they had heard only lies, that the Americans were savages, that surrender meant death. Yet here were those same men, carrying their sons to safety. "Why are you helping us?" a woman asked through a translator. The medic only shrugged. "Because we can." When the shooting finally stopped and the surrender was signed, many families gathered at the village edge as the Americans prepared to move on. Mothers held their healed children, some still limping but alive. They brought baskets of bread as thanks, though food was scarce. Soldiers smiled awkwardly, unsure how to accept gratitude from those they'd once fought. Some shook hands through tears. Others simply saluted and walked away. Months later, when Germany began to rebuild, villagers spoke of the day the Americans arrived, not as invaders, but as men who stopped the bleeding. Those memories would outlast the ruins. Children who once trembled at the sight of foreign uniforms would grow up remembering hands that brought medicine, not fire. In that brief spring of 1945, amid destruction, the line between enemy and savior blurred, and what remained was something stronger than victory. It was mercy, written in the language of healing. The thunder of war had faded, but its scars were everywhere. Germany in mid-1945 was a nation on its knees. Its cities turned to skeletons of brick and ash. Its rail lines snapped like brittle bones. Amid this wreckage, the true battle began, not for territory, but for souls. American troops, occupying what had once been Hitler's empire, now faced an unexpected mission, rebuilding a people they had been trained to destroy. It was a test of morality unlike any fought on the battlefield. For the medical units that moved into the occupied zones, the work never stopped. Colonel John F. Binkley, a surgeon from Ohio, led one of the first organized medical detachments in Bavaria. His orders were precise: stabilize, prevent epidemic, restore civilian health. Yet few understood what that meant in practice. Clinics were gone, pharmacies looted, and doctors either dead or missing. The Americans converted barracks into hospitals, used captured Wehrmacht trucks as ambulances, and sterilized surgical tools over kerosene flames. Engineers strung electric lines through gutted buildings while medics improvised operating tables from door panels. The first wave of patients were children, many emaciated, limping, and coughing from untreated infections. American field hospitals reported treating nearly 2,000 civilian cases within weeks of Germany's surrender. There was no distinction between uniform and civilian, only urgency. Even the Red Cross struggled to keep up, relying heavily on U.S. Army logistics. Every soldier understood that disease could undo victory faster than bullets. One report noted that typhus, dysentery, and gangrene threatened entire towns if medical order was not restored immediately. The logistics behind this mercy were immense. Supply trains from depots in France brought plasma, penicillin, and surgical gauze to the new frontier of compassion. Much of it was engineered by American industrial giants: Eli Lilly's pharmaceutical plants, General Electric sterilizers, and DuPont's synthetic bandages. Each label carried the story of a nation whose factories had once built tanks, but were now sending life instead of death. Crates marked Medical Corps property were stacked beside shattered German railway stations, guarded not by riflemen but by medics to the locals. It was incomprehensible. Soldiers who had bombed their cities now delivered babies and vaccinated children. In one town near Augsburg, a young German nurse named Liesel Weber watched as U.S. Army doctors trained local women in sterilization and wound care. "They showed us how to wash instruments with boiling water," she later recalled, and they smiled. I had not seen an American smile before. Her diary described the surreal shift from hatred to gratitude, a moment when fear dissolved into understanding. Behind the scenes, the Allied command saw a deeper strategy. Winning peace required more than surrender. It required trust. The policy of denazification was not only about removing symbols. It was about teaching humanity through action. Every act of compassion became political. Each healed child was a message that democracy carried medicine, not revenge. Psychological assessments compiled by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey later concluded that these humanitarian efforts had a profound demoralizing effect on lingering Nazi sympathizers. The conqueror's mercy proved more destructive to totalitarian faith than force of arms. Still, challenges persisted. In some camps, resentment flared. Hardline officers and Nazi loyalists warned civilians that American aid was a trap. "They want to re-educate your children into slaves," one pamphlet read, secretly circulated in rural areas. Yet hunger and sickness spoke louder than ideology. Mothers brought their infants to American clinics regardless of propaganda. Every injection, every spoon of medicine, eroded the walls that years of lies had built. The soldiers themselves faced moral whiplash. Only weeks before, they had liberated concentration camps. They had seen corpses stacked in railcars, the smell of burning flesh still clinging to their uniforms. Now those same men were treating German toddlers with scarlet fever. It was not easy. Many confessed to conflicting emotions. "How do you forgive a nation that did this?" wrote a medic in his journal while bandaging a child's hand. Maybe you don't. Maybe you just choose to stop the bleeding. By late summer, the U.S. Army Civil Affairs Division implemented structured medical programs across the occupied zones. American engineers restored water systems to prevent cholera outbreaks, while doctors reopened hospitals using salvaged German equipment. Trucks from the Quartermaster Corps carried not only supplies but also hope: milk powder, sulfa drugs, and clean bandages. German civilians began to assist voluntarily, forming committees under American supervision. For the first time, they took responsibility for their own recovery. Among the most astonishing transformations occurred in small Bavarian villages. In one, an American surgeon named Captain Harold Peters set up a mobile clinic in a former beer hall. Locals arrived hesitantly, then daily, until the line stretched down the street. Children were weighed, vaccinated, and given vitamins. Peters noted in his field report that discipline among the population improved markedly following humanitarian assistance. The children started greeting soldiers without fear, some even waving American flags made from scraps of cloth. But compassion carried risk. On several occasions, soldiers were reprimanded for fraternization, handing out food, playing with children, and even attending church with locals. Army regulations forbade close contact with the German populace. Yet many disobeyed quietly. It was not rebellion, but instinct. After years of brutality, kindness became a silent protest against war itself. One person smuggled sugar from rations to make candy for the village school. Another fixed a boy's wooden toy tank using leftover wire from a radio. These small acts, never recorded in official reports, carried the weight of reconciliation. As the months passed, the relationship between occupier and occupied evolved. German doctors returned from POW camps and began working alongside Americans, sharing knowledge and rebuilding clinics. The partnership was uneasy at first, but soon practical necessity overcame pride. The shared language of medicine dissolved barriers faster than diplomacy ever could. "We spoke through gestures," recalled one German surgeon. "But when the child stopped crying, we understood each other." By the end of 1945, the transformation was visible even to outsiders. Photographs showed children playing near American vehicles, mothers chatting with medics, and nurses wearing Red Cross armbands sewn from old flags. What began as emergency relief had become the first step toward a moral reconstruction. The defeated people were learning again to trust, and the victors were learning the burden of mercy. In Washington, policy analysts noted that the success of this medical initiative had shaped the broader occupation philosophy. General Lucius D. Clay, later military governor, summarized it simply: "We conquered the disease before we conquered the hatred." His words reflected what many soldiers had already realized on the ground, that compassion, when wielded deliberately, could be as strategic as any weapon. By the winter of 1946, as snow blanketed the ruins and church bells rang once more, the lines of occupation blurred into a fragile peace. American doctors trained their German counterparts to run local clinics independently. Children who had once flinched at the sight of a uniform now waved goodbye to departing convoys. The Americans, exhausted but resolute, moved on to new assignments. Behind them, in the villages once silent with fear, life began to whisper again. The war that had divided nations was ending not with parades, but with bandages and handshakes. Yet the question lingered in every soldier's mind. What did this mercy mean? Was it redemption or merely duty? As one medic looked back at a small boy waving from the road's edge, he muttered quietly to himself, "Maybe this is how wars are truly won." The engine roared. The truck disappeared into the mist, and the boy kept waving until it was gone. In the spring of 1946, Germany's wounds were still raw, but something irreversible had begun to take root, a quiet understanding that mercy had triumphed where violence had failed. Across the American zone of occupation, stories circulated in both English and German newspapers about soldiers who had delivered babies, rebuilt hospitals, and treated the enemy's children without hesitation. For the German people, those acts of compassion became the first cracks in the wall of despair that Nazism had left behind. And for the Americans, they became proof that victory was not just about destroying armies. It was about rebuilding humanity. Captain Harold Peters, the surgeon who had transformed a beer hall into a clinic, later wrote to his wife that "it feels like I'm stitching up a country." He wasn't wrong. By mid-year, the U.S. Army had transitioned many of its medical operations to local control. German doctors, once scattered or dismissed, were reinstated after denazification checks. The Americans supplied them with penicillin, X-ray units, and surgical tools. What had begun as improvised field care became the foundation of a modernized medical network. For many villages, it was the first organized healthcare they had ever known. In Munich, the 98th Medical Battalion converted a bombed-out hotel into a children's hospital. The rooms still smelled of smoke, but the corridors filled with the sounds of footsteps and laughter. American nurses taught German trainees to administer vaccines and keep infection logs. They wrote the instructions in English and drew sketches when words failed. One nurse, Margaret Klein from Iowa, later recalled how the mothers would bow their heads in gratitude. They were ashamed, she said, but also relieved. You could see it in their eyes. They were seeing Americans as people, not enemies. In one rural town near Fulda, a child named Annalise lost both parents in the bombing raids. Her leg was shattered by debris, and infection had set in. American medics amputated below the knee, then built her a crude prosthetic from wood and metal scraps. When she first stood again, the villagers gathered to watch. A U.S. lieutenant saluted her. The girl saluted back, wobbling on her new leg. Years later, she told interviewers that moment taught her what dignity meant, that it could come from compassion, even from an enemy. Those who once wore the swastika armband now looked on as American doctors operated in churches and barns. Their helmets hung beside crucifixes. The contrast was inescapable. In a nation where ideology had once deified cruelty, it was now mercy that commanded respect. German clergy began preaching that forgiveness was not weakness, but the foundation for survival. Some American officers attended those sermons, standing silently at the back. Both sides were trying to learn how to live with what they had done and what they had seen. The psychological toll on American troops was immense. They had marched through death camps and bombed cities into rubble, yet now they found themselves comforting the survivors. For many, this reversal became the defining chapter of their service. Letters home spoke less of triumph and more of redemption. "We came here to end a war," one corporal wrote. but I think we're learning how to end hate. These sentiments were quietly encouraged by their commanders, who saw the value of moral rehabilitation, not just for the Germans, but for the soldiers themselves in the years that followed. The humanitarian policies established in post-war Germany became blueprints for future occupations and peacekeeping missions. Military engineers who had built pontoon bridges across the Rhine now drew plans for hospitals and orphanages. Supply officers who once calculated artillery shells now calculated penicillin doses. The logistics of war had turned into the logistics of compassion. Factories that had produced bullets under the Reich were repurposed under Allied oversight to manufacture surgical instruments and prosthetic limbs. The economic revival that historians would later call the German miracle had, in many ways, begun in those makeshift medical tents. For the German families who had watched Americans treat their children, gratitude slowly replaced terror. They began naming newborns after the soldiers and nurses who saved them: James, Harold, and Margaret. In the years to come, letters arrived at U.S. Army posts bearing photos of healthy children once near death. They were simple tokens, but they traveled across oceans and years. Reminders that healing could outlast hate. Historians later noted that this humanitarian dimension of the occupation, largely undocumented compared to the grand politics of Reconstruction, was among its most enduring legacies. The Marshall Plan, when it arrived, was built on the same principle that had guided those first medics, that mercy could rebuild faster than money. American sociologists studying the early post-war years found that trust in the occupiers rose sharply wherever medical aid was most visible. Compassion, they concluded, had achieved what propaganda never could. In one poignant moment in late 1946, a ceremony was held in Stuttgart to reopen a rebuilt children's hospital. On the front steps stood German doctors in white coats beside American officers in olive drab. The band played not an anthem of victory, but a hymn of mourning and renewal. A local mayor, who had lost his son in the bombing, gave a short speech. "You conquered our pride," he said, "but you saved our children. For that, we cannot hate you anymore." The silence that followed was deeper than applause. Many American veterans carried those memories home, long after they'd shed their uniforms. Some became doctors, nurses, or teachers, inspired by what they had seen. Others wrote memoirs, describing how compassion had changed their understanding of strength. Their children grew up hearing stories not of battles, but of kindness in the ruins. For them, the war's true victory was measured not in land or surrender documents, but in lives restored. For Germany, the experience reshaped a generation. The children who had been treated by American doctors grew up in a democratic nation rebuilt on ideals their parents had never known. They studied medicine, engineering, and philosophy, fields once twisted by ideology, now guided by conscience. Some of them would later correspond with the very soldiers who had helped them, sending Christmas cards or invitations to visit the towns they'd once occupied. The past was not forgotten, but it was transformed by the dawn of the 1950s. Germany had changed beyond recognition. Its streets bustled again, its hospitals gleamed with modern equipment, and its universities reopened their halls. Few remembered the names of the medics who had arrived in those first chaotic days after surrender, but their influence remained in every clinic and classroom. They had been soldiers of mercy, fighting a different kind of war, the war against hatred itself. In the end, no medals were awarded for treating enemy children. No parades were held for the men and women who built hospitals instead of fortifications. But in the quiet hearts of those they saved, the memory endured. Decades later, an elderly German woman told her grandson about the day an American soldier lifted her from the rubble and carried her to safety. "He didn't see me as German," she said softly. "He just saw that I was hurt." That, perhaps, was the final victory of the Second World War, not written in treaties or borders, but in small, merciful acts that outlived every empire. Amid the ashes of the Reich, where hatred had once ruled, compassion had taken its place. And though the world would go on to fight new wars, the lesson of that moment remained eternal. That even in humanity's darkest hour, the light of mercy can still find its way through the ruins.